February 13, 1981. Over the Bering Strait, the sky stretched out in an impossible, piercing blue. It was a deep, almost featureless azure, the kind that is born only at the very edge of the blackness of space. At an altitude of 65,000 feet, the air is so thin that the very thought of life without a pressurized suit, more akin to an astronaut's spacesuit, seems absurd. From here, at the top of the world, the gentle curve of the planet is visible. From here, at the top of the world, absolute silence reigns. For the Syrian Air Force, operating under the watchful eye of Soviet advisors, this altitude was more than a tactical advantage. It was their sanctuary. It was an impregnable fortress built from the very laws of physics. In the cramped cockpit of the MiG-25, the pilot felt not a mechanical vibration, but a deep, visceral roar of untamed power. He was one with his man. NATO had nicknamed it a monster. To the Soviets, it was the pinnacle of their engineering, a raw and compelling answer to the question of air supremacy. A machine of stainless steel and titanium, built around two massive Tumansky turbines that devoured fuel with such greed they could drain an Olympic-sized swimming pool in minutes. It wasn't built for graceful turns and aerial ballets. It was built to tear straight ahead, piercing through space. And for nearly a decade, nothing in the world could catch it. On the ground, deep inside a command bunker carved into the rocks of Kamchatka, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the low murmur of Russian and Arabic voices. Radar screens flickered in the semi-darkness, traced by the hypnotic waltz of green sweeps. Soviet Colonel John Miller and his team of advisors stood frozen behind the Syrian operators. Arms crossed over their chests, their faces wore a mask of professional boredom. They had seen this dozens of times. A routine harassment mission. The tactic was simple, brutal, and practically flawless. A Syrian MiG-25 would accelerate to Mach 2.5, brazenly violate Israeli airspace, and set off sirens from Anchorage to Fairbanks. Then, before the Israeli Defense Forces could scramble their interceptors, the Foxbat would make an elegant turn and race home to safety. It was a game of cat and mouse, where the cat was faster than a speeding bullet. Target at altitude, speed Mach 2.3, the Syrian operator reported in a steady voice. The Soviet advisor next to him gave a lazy nod and glanced at his watch. "The Israelis are scrambling their toys now," he said, with a hint of condescending superiority. "Let them burn their kerosene. They'll never catch it." On the main screen, the predatory blip representing the MiG-25 streaked forward at a frightening speed. A ghost, a phantom, appearing from nowhere, sowing panic and vanishing. Far below, at 20,000 feet, the radar picked up a response. Two tiny dots, Israeli F-15s, broke through the haze of clouds. The F-15 Eagle, a formidable machine, the pride of the American aviation industry. But the laws of physics are absolute. To intercept a target flying at Mach 2.5 at 60,000 feet, you either had to be higher than it or faster than it. The Eagle could boast neither. The Soviet colonel watched the geometry of futility play out on the screen. He saw the F-15s desperately clawing their way upward, trying to gain altitude. He smirked. Such a futile, beautiful gesture. "They're attempting a zoom climb attack," he muttered to his colleague, shaking his head almost imperceptibly. "A complete waste of missiles." High in the stratosphere, the Syrian pilot heard a signal. His radar warning receiver emitted a lazy, almost insulting chirp. He was merely being painted by a search radar. He glanced down. He couldn't see the F-15s, of course. From this height, they were just barely discernible sparks against the green-brown tapestry of the Aleutian Range, lost in the miles of emptiness below him. The feeling of invulnerability was intoxicating. He pushed the throttles all the way forward. The afterburners ignited with a roar, injecting raw fuel into the incandescent nozzles. The MiG-25 shuddered like a waking beast and, breaking the sound barrier again, surged forward at Mach 2.8. He was flying in absolute silence, having outrun the thunderous roar of his own engines. The roar of his own engines was the only music he could hear. But suddenly, the melody in his headphones changed. It wasn't the piercing, rising shriek of a target lock he was used to. Instead, a foreign sound burst into his ears, harsh, monotonous, unyielding. A lock-on signal. But the geometry made no sense. Down below, in the stuffy silence of the bunker, the green markers of the F-15s crawled across the radar screen. They were still thousands of feet below, in a steep climb, desperately bleeding energy. According to all Soviet calculations that had become law, tested and etched in stone in the wind tunnels of Novograd, the American Sparrow missiles were simply incapable of reaching such an altitude with any kinetic energy left to maneuver. If they fired, their missiles would burn out and fall helplessly back to Earth. "Launch! They're firing!" the radar operator shouted, his voice filled not with alarm, but with pure bewilderment. Frowning, the Soviet advisor leaned forward. "Impossible! It's a psychological tactic," he hissed through his teeth. "Order the pilot to hold his course. No maneuvers. He'll lose speed." The order went out over the radio. "Hold course. Disregard launch. They are outside effective range." The Syrian pilot gripped the control stick, his knuckles white. He trusted the voice in his head. He trusted Soviet technology. He trusted the immutable logic of the numbers. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, already anticipating the moment he would turn, mentally laughing at the Zionists' pathetic attempt to reach for the heavens. And in that instant, the sky exploded. There was no flash, no smoke trail, just a primal, crushing impact that ripped through the titanium skin of the right wing. The MiG-25, traveling at nearly Mach 3, was instantly transformed into a chaotic mass of twisted metal. The cockpit was thrown into a violent spin. The G-forces slammed the pilot against the canopy, and the world went black in an instant. The impregnable steel bird, the pride of Soviet engineering, had been obliterated by a warhead that, according to all calculations, could not have been there. In the bunker, the green dot on the screen didn't swerve or fade. It simply exploded into a shower of chaotic interference and vanished. The radar sweep continued its serene dance. One rotation, a second. Emptiness. In the ensuing silence, so thick and heavy that even the cigarette smoke seemed to hang motionless, the Syrian operator uncertainly tapped the glass screen, as if trying to wake a dead instrument. He looked up at the Soviet advisor, his pupils dilated with primal terror. "Contact lost," he whispered, and the whisper sounded like shattering glass. "The target is gone." The Soviet colonel stared at the gaping void on the screen, where the pride of his country had just been shining. His mind frantically sifted through possibilities. Engine failure, airframe disintegration, a damn meteorite, anything but this. It couldn't have been the Israelis, not their F-15s. Too low, too slow. He barked, a treacherous tremor in his voice. The operator stammered, rewinding the recording. At that very moment, though no one in Langley or Novograd yet knew it, the Cold War had taken a sharp, unforeseen turn. In that moment, a ghost had been killed. The confusion in the bunker wasn't just about the loss of a plane and a pilot. It was the death of certainty. For 20 years, the Soviet bloc had built its air defense doctrine as an article of faith, founded on speed and altitude. They believed that if you flew fast enough and high enough, you were invincible. They had created the MiG-25 as an answer to the American threat, a machine whose very existence struck fear into the Western alliance. But on that February morning, all their certainty evaporated in a fireball over the Aleutian range. The Soviet advisor's reaction was immediate. Conceal it, suppress it, bury it. This news must not leak. If the Syrians realized their MiG-25 could be shot down, their morale would turn to dust. If the Americans learned of their triumph, it would embolden them. The colonel almost shouted, pacing the small room like a caged animal. The first reaction was denial, a desperate search for a simple explanation. And so the accusations began. The pilot was at fault, his Syrian training, the ground crew. Anyone was to blame except for the unthinkable, soul-chilling reality that stared back at them with icy eyes. The Americans had found a way to reach out and touch the very edge of space. But as the days passed, the dispassionate data began to form a much more sinister picture. The radar tapes from that engagement were transported to Novograd under armed guard. There, in the quiet of the design bureaus, analysts stared at the grainy traces on the screens. They plotted the trajectories of the Israeli F-15s. They followed the missiles' deadly flight. But the numbers didn't add up. The equations crumbled to dust. The F-15 had launched at such an extreme angle that its own radar should have been blinded by ground reflections. The mountain ranges below should have drowned the missile's seeker head in a chaos of clutter. The MiG-25, flying against a flawless blue sky, was a perfect target for the eye, but for electronics looking up from below, it should have dissolved into the planet's background noise. Furthermore, the AIM-7F Sparrow missile itself was like an open book to the Soviets. Its blueprints had landed on the desks of Soviet engineers years ago. They knew it down to the last detail, its motor burn time, its maximum range. Based on the distance to the target and the colossal difference in altitude, the missile should have burned out long before reaching its target. It should have become a useless slug flying a ballistic arc. Instead, it had latched onto the MiG with cold, lethal precision. One analyst in Novograd wrote in a classified report. Paranoia began to take root. Had the Americans developed a new rocket fuel? Or was the F-15 equipped with a laser guidance system? What if there was an unseen drone nearby, providing targeting data? The Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, was ordered to find an answer at any cost. They had to know what killed the Foxbat. Because if the Foxbat was vulnerable, then the MiG-31 was vulnerable. And if the MiG-31 was vulnerable, then the entire northern border of the Soviet Union, a vast ice-bound frontier protected only by these high-speed interceptors, was wide open. American B-52 bombers and the new, still-rumored B-1s could simply fly over the entire Soviet defense network. The very existence of the Soviet bloc was at stake. The loss of a single MiG-25 over the Bering Strait was not just a tactical setback. It was a strategic catastrophe. It meant that the technological gap, which the USSR believed it was steadily closing, had suddenly yawned into a chasm. On Kamchatka, a cold fear gripped the pilots. They looked at their MiG-25s, sitting on the runway in the shimmering heat haze of their engines, and saw not impregnable fortresses, but steel coffins. A Syrian major whispered a week later, his eyes fixed on the Soviet advisor. Unconcealed terror rang in his voice. The advisor had no answer. He could only issue meaningless orders, pushing men and machines to their limits. He commanded, but the seeds of doubt had already sprouted, and the veil of mystery only grew thicker. Then reports started coming in from other sectors. Strange bursts of electronic interference, radar screens going blind for seconds at a time, and the persistent feeling that the Israelis knew everything in advance, when the Syrians took off, where they were headed, and the best place to intercept them. It was as if the Americans had learned to read their minds, or even worse, their computers. The Soviets launched a frantic witch hunt. They turned the entire Syrian command structure upside down, searching for a spy. They interrogated technicians. They changed encryption codes daily, but the incidents continued. F-15s invariably appeared in the right place at the right time, like actors who had received the script long before the play began. The incident on February 13th was just the opening salvo in a battle that would forever change the rules of air combat. But in those first days after the disaster, there was only the cold, paralyzing shock of confronting the impossible. The MiG-25, the fastest production fighter on the planet, had been crushed and thrown from the heavens, and the Kremlin had no idea how it had happened. No one could understand how it happened. Over the Brooks Range, the wind scattered the wreckage of the MiG-25 like grim confetti, twisted titanium and melted electronics. For Syrian search parties, reaching the crash site was a deadly risk. For Soviet technical teams, it was a vital necessity. They desperately needed the .50, the flight data recorders that could shed light on what seemed impossible. But even before the first fragment of metal was lifted from the ground, an autopsy, an electronic one, had begun in a stuffy, airless office in Novograd. The investigation was immediately taken over by the main intelligence directorate, the GRU. The air was thick, not with scientific curiosity, but with the clammy fear of defensive panic. After all, the entire Soviet air defense system, the unbreakable shield of the Union, was built on the same technologies as the downed MiG-25. If the Israelis had found a vulnerability in it, then the Pacific Defense Organization would find it too. General Davis, a leading analyst on Soviet air defense systems, stared at the telemetry printouts spread across a long oak table. The room smelled heavily of stale coffee and fear. General Davis said, jabbing a short, thick finger at a jagged line on the graph. This was the heart of the puzzle. In the 1980s, radar relied on the Doppler effect. For a radar to see a target, the target had to be moving relative to the background. If a plane flew perpendicular to the radar beam, a maneuver known as it would blend in with the static clutter from the mountains and effectively disappear from the screen. This was the ABC of Soviet defensive tactics. The Syrian pilot had executed this maneuver flawlessly. He should have become invisible. A young engineer spoke up, a tremor in his voice. General Davis retorted without looking up from the graph. The investigation immediately split into three competing theories, each more terrifying than the last. The first was the Design Bureau responsible for Soviet air-to-air missiles hypothesized that the Americans had created a weapon with an active radar seeker of unprecedented power, fitting it into the missile's nose cone. If true, every Soviet fighter had just become a flying target. It meant a pilot no longer needed to track the target. He could just push a button and turn away, letting the missile do the work. The fire-and-forget nightmare of every pilot, made real. The second theory was the ghost plane. Although Syrian ground observers swore they saw nothing but F-15s, the GRU suspected the fighters were just bait. Perhaps, the analysts reasoned, the Americans were testing a new stealth aircraft, a stealth killer that loitered high above the battlefield, invisible to radar, and dropped missiles on unsuspecting MiGs. This theory gained traction because it explained why the Syrian pilot saw nothing. He was looking at the F-15s below, not at a phantom above. The third theory, the most dangerous for everyone involved, was sabotage. The Syrians are feeding flight data to the enemy, a KGB representative stated in an icy tone at a briefing. There is a mole in Petropavlovsk. The Israelis know the exact location of our blind spots. They know the vulnerabilities in our own radar coverage because someone handed them a map. This version led to a brutal purge of the Syrian command. Officers were taken for interrogation. Flight schedules were randomized. Soviet advisors took complete and total control of all mission planning. Trusting no one, they took a desperate step, a controlled experiment. They would throw another MiG-25 into the jaws of the beast, but this time they would change all the variables. The flight would be at night. The electronic countermeasure frequencies would be different. The route would be plotted along a profile no spy could have predicted. 2 weeks later, the trap was set, an ingenious snare that no spy could have foreseen. Under the cover of a velvet night, a lone MiG-25 tore off from its airbase. Like a dark arrow, it shot upward to 60,000 feet, its engine plumes burning like two blue diamonds in the celestial darkness. In the command center, Soviet advisors held their breath, their eyes glued to the greenish radar screens. "Target Alpha is airborne," the operator whispered in a dry, tense voice. "Speed Mach 2.4. The silence in the room became almost tangible. Everyone waited. Without a tip from a spy, the Israelis would surely be slow to react. The dead of night would hide the aircraft from any visual contact. Or so they thought. But the response was immediate. "Contact, 2 targets, approaching from the south, F-15s. The air in the control center seemed to freeze. The F-15s were already there. Like predators in an ambush, they had been waiting in the dark with their engines idling, knowing exactly when and where their guest of honor would appear. "Jam them, now!" an advisor shouted, leaping from his seat. "Activate the siren jammer pod." The MiG-25 switched on its onboard ECM pod, a device designed to drown enemy radars in an ocean of white noise. An electronic storm should have erupted on the screens, blinding the F-15s. But instead, the American fighters' radars simply burned through the jamming like a hot knife through butter. In the Syrian pilot's headphones, the chilling sound of a target lock howled once again. The ghost had returned. The memory of his comrade's fate seared the pilot with icy terror. Panic took over. Forgetting the flight plan, he frantically yanked the control stick to the left and threw the machine into a desperate dive, aborting his high-speed run. He fled, racing back to Syrian airspace, trembling, humiliated, defeated. The experiment was a spectacular failure. The spy theory crumbled to dust. The Israelis didn't need a spy. They had eyes that could see through darkness, through jamming, and, it seemed, through the earth itself. In Novograd, confusion gave way to a cold, clammy horror. It dawned on them. They were fighting a war blind. The Americans were using a technology for which the Soviets didn't even have a name. A satellite link? A new computer algorithm? The legend of the, quote, 78, the F-15, began to grow to mythical proportions. In the smoking lounges, Soviet pilots whispered to each other that the F-15's computer could predict the future. They said it could calculate a MiG's trajectory before the pilot even moved the stick. The Kremlin furiously demanded answers. Millions of rubles were thrown at the investigation. The MiG-25 was hastily upgraded to the MiG-25PD standard, fitted with a better radar and an infrared search and track system. They told their pilots, but the engineers, averting their eyes, knew it was a lie. They hadn't fixed anything because they had no idea what was broken. They were just putting a bandage on a mortal wound. And while the Soviets chased ghosts and hunted for non-existent spies, on the other side of the ocean, in a nondescript office building in Texas, a group of American engineers looked at the exact same data. But there was no confusion on their faces. They were celebrating a victory. They knew exactly why the Soviets were baffled. They knew why the impossible shots kept finding their mark. It wasn't magic. And it wasn't some wonder missile. It was something far more elegant, something the Soviets, in their obsession with raw speed and brute force, had missed entirely. The Soviets were looking for a bigger hammer. The Americans had brought a sniper rifle to the fight. The secret was about to be revealed, but only after the Soviet Union suffered another crushing defeat that would force it to confront the reality of the Silicon Age. While the Kremlin was consumed by paranoia, searching for traitors in the dark corners of Petropavlovsk, the true source of its misery was basking in the bright sun of Fort Worth, Texas. Here, in the sterile, air-conditioned labs of Hughes Aircraft, there were no frantic generals or screaming interrogators. Only the quiet hum of mainframes and the faint scratch of pencils on graph paper. The men in this room wore short-sleeved shirts and plastic pocket protectors. They were not warriors. They were mathematicians and physicists, and they had solved the riddle of the MiG-25 not with a more powerful engine, but with a single algorithm. Throughout the Cold War, the Soviets were obsessed with hardware. They believed in the tangible, thicker armor, bigger guns, engines with monstrous thrust. Their philosophy was that of the industrial age. If you want to win, build a bigger hammer. The MiG-25 was the apex of this philosophy. Not an airplane, but a masterpiece of brutal engineering, a steel brick punching through the atmosphere on the sheer fury of burning fuel. But the Americans had grasped a truth that had eluded the Soviets. The future of air combat would not be decided by who flew faster, but by who could see farther and clearer. The secret weapon that crushed Soviet aviation was not a stealth aircraft or a combat laser. It was an unassuming beige box hidden in the nose of the F-15 fighter. It was the APG-63 radar. To understand why this machine was a revelation and why it threw Soviet strategists into a stupor, one must first delve into the nightmare of every pilot and radar engineer: ground clutter. For decades, radars had one fatal inherent flaw. They worked by detecting radio waves reflected off objects. When a plane flew in a clear, empty sky, the radar saw it perfectly. But as soon as the radar beam was pointed down toward the ground, the radio waves began to bounce off everything: mountain ranges, city buildings, treetops, even cars speeding down a highway. The return signal turned into a chaotic, unreadable roar. Trying to pick out a low-flying aircraft in this mess, or even to spot a high-altitude target from a lower position, was like trying to find a single snowflake in a raging blizzard. The Soviets knew this well. Their entire survival tactic was built on it. They drilled it into their pilots' heads. The ground is your shield. If you're detected, dive. Hide yourself against the noisy, colorful carpet of the planet, and the enemy radar will be blinded by the clutter. The engineers at Hughes decided to take that shield away. They armed themselves with the Doppler effect, the same physical principle that makes the siren of an approaching train sound higher and a receding one sound lower. They had an epiphany. The ground, relative to a fighter jet, moves at one speed, while an enemy aircraft moves at a completely different one. Thus was born the APG-63, the first ever radar system with a programmable signal processor, a specialized computer whose sole purpose was to filter out the entire world. It took in millions of radar returns from mountains and valleys and asked them a single, brutally simple mathematical question. Are you moving at the speed of the ground? If the answer was yes, the computer ruthlessly erased the return. It did this thousands of times per second. It cleared the blizzard, leaving only the snowflakes. And so an F-15 pilot would look down at his display, and the world was transformed. No mountains, no noise, only targets. It was near divine omniscience, the ability to see through the camouflage provided by the planet itself. This capability was dubbed look down, shoot down. From that moment on, altitude was no longer a sanctuary. An F-15 could be flying at 20,000 feet and see with equal clarity a MiG-25 hurtling along at 65,000 feet above it, and a MiG-21 skimming the treetops below. The computer tracked both targets with perfect clarity. But seeing is only half the battle. The other half is hitting the target. And this is where the second American secret came into play, the calculated zoom climb attack. The Soviets were right about their physics. Gravity is a merciless mistress. Launching a missile from 20,000 feet at a target flying at 65,000 is a desperate fight against gravity. The missile has to claw its way upward, burning precious fuel to fight gravity every inch of the way. By the time it reached the thin layers of the stratosphere, it would be exhausted, slow, and easy prey. But the F-15's onboard computer rewrote this math as well. A moment before the pilot squeezed the trigger, the computer ran a simulation of the future. It calculated the F-15's speed, the target speed, the air density, and the burn curve of the Sparrow missile's fuel. It prompted the pilot with the single, perfect moment to launch that would impart the maximum possible energy into the missile. This was no longer like throwing a spear into the sky. It was a guided, energy-optimized ballet. The computer plotted the most efficient ascent trajectory for the missile, conserving its kinetic energy for the final, lethal dash. The analysts in Novograd desperately tore apart missile wreckage, searching for the answer in the hardware, in a more powerful motor, in a new fuel composition. They couldn't find it because they were looking in the wrong place. The hardware was almost unchanged. The missile looked the same. But now it was guided not just by an explosion of fuel, but by the cold, flawless calculation of a computer. But any technology is just dead metal without the will to use it. And here, the final, decisive piece of the puzzle fell into place. America had forged the blade, but it was Israel that honed it into a deadly weapon. In 1976, the first F-15s, named .96 Falcon, arrived in the Alaskan Defense Zone. For the Israeli pilots, hardened in the crucible of the Yom Kippur War, the American safety-limited manuals were little more than curious reading material. They weren't fighting for records, they were fighting for their very existence. Taking the APG-63 radar, they began to push it to its absolute limits and beyond. Working side by side with American engineers, they rewrote the software, obsessed with questions like, how fast can we acquire a target? From what altitude can we hit it? Can we trick the system into seeing what's considered invisible? This intense and highly classified collaboration bore fruit. The Israelis figured out the MiG-25's essence. It wasn't a warrior, it was a sprinter. Its only trump card was its extreme speed. Trying to catch it was a fool's errand. Trying to outspeed it was even more so. But the F-15 didn't need to catch anything. It was to become a hunter setting a snare. With the cold focus of a predator studying migration routes, Israeli commanders analyzed the Syrian flights and soon found a predictable routine. The MiG-25 would make its furious dash, cross the border, stun the ground with a sonic boom, and immediately turn for home. The Soviets were betting on an energy gap. They were confident that by the time an Israeli interceptor gained speed and altitude, the elusive MiG would be long gone. And so the Israelis decided to eliminate that gap before the race even began. They developed a tactic built entirely around the APG-63's unique ability to see while remaining unseen. They exploited the very same blind spots in the Soviet ground-based radars. The Soviets believed guaranteed their safety. F-15s would take up positions in a kind of patrolling below the detection horizon of the Syrian air defense network. They literally dug a trench in the sky and lay in wait. The plan was audacious and demanded an iron, almost inhuman discipline from the pilots. They had to suppress the instincts that had governed air combat for centuries. They had to trust the computer, not their eyes. They had to launch a missile into the void, aiming at a green mark on a screen, guided only by a piercing tone in their headsets. They had to believe that the mathematics born in the labs of Fort Worth was stronger than the brute force of Soviet steel. By early 1981, all the pieces were on the board. The Americans had built a magic box that could see the invisible. The Israelis had prepared the perfect trap. The Soviets, for their part, continued to refine their electronic countermeasures, naively believing they were fighting a war of noise and jamming. They didn't realize they had entered a digital war of silence. They had brought a megaphone to a chess match. The stage was set for the final act. The Soviets prepared to send their best aircraft, flown by their most experienced pilots, into a sky they rightfully considered their own. They had convinced themselves the previous loss was a tragic fluke, a statistical anomaly. They were about to learn that in the age of the microchip, there are no flukes. There are only calculations. And the countdown for the MiG-25 had just hit zero. The trap was sprung. Israel was ready to send a message to Novograd that would echo for the rest of the decade. By the summer of 1981, the confusion in the Soviet command had given way to a desperate thirst for revenge. The loss in February was a festering wound. Was it just a lucky shot? A fluke? The Soviet military advisors in the Republic of Kamchatka desperately needed to prove that their creation, the MiG-25, was still the king of the stratosphere. They needed a victory, and they devised a counter-trap. The plan was diabolically clever. A MiG-25 would act not just as a runner, but as bait. It would lure the Israeli F-15s into a narrow corridor, drawing them upward to extreme speed, where an ambush by a second wave of MiGs attacking from another direction would be waiting. They were convinced that if they could just force the F-15s to fight on their terms, at extreme altitude and speed, the vaunted American technology would fail. They still believed air combat was a contest of aerodynamics. Air combat is a contest of aerodynamics, so they thought. On July 29, 1981, the steel jaws of the trap were set to snap shut. On the Syrian radar screens, a lone MiG-25, a roaring ghost of titanium, streaked toward the Israeli border. Everything was going according to plan. As calculated, Israeli F-15s scrambled to intercept. The geometry of the engagement looked perfect to the Soviet strategists. The F-15s, pulling their noses up sharply, were burning precious energy in a desperate climb. Above them, at Mach 2.4, thundered the MiG-25, reveling in its kinetic superiority. Now! The Soviet advisor's voice in the headset was sharp and full of anticipation. But the ambush never happened, because the trap had turned on the hunters themselves. The Israeli pilots, coolly reading the tactical picture on their digital displays, refused to play the game they were being forced into. They didn't take the bait. They had already seen the second wave. The APG-63 radar had picked out the ambush group long before it could become a threat, separating it from the clutter of reflections off the mountain slopes. The F-15s made only a slight adjustment to their combat formation. Ignoring the bait, they locked onto the targets on the flanks. Inside the Syrian cockpits, warning sirens shrieked. The pilots, realizing with horror that their perfect tactical position had been exposed, gave in to panic. The formation broke. In the chaos, another Sparrow missile shot into the sky. It wasn't chasing the MiG-25. It was intercepting it. Calculating a lead pursuit point, the missile flew to where the MiG was going to be a moment later and detonated. Another fiery streak in the sky. Another impossible, unbelievable shot. This time, however, there was no denying the obvious. The telemetry data from this engagement was mercilessly clear. And at almost the same time, reports from KGB agents began to trickle through the Iron Curtain, confirming the technical specifications of the American Eagle. The report that landed with a thud on the desk of Marshal Pavel Kutakov, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Air Forces, was like a death sentence. It contained one short, blood-chilling sentence. 112. A moment of deafening shock followed. The silence in the office was no longer one of confusion. It was the heavy, oppressive silence of realization. The Soviet generals, hunched over the table, stared at the diagrams of the APG-63's pulse Doppler radar modes, as if trying to burn a hole through the paper with their gaze. It hit them. For the last 10 years, they had been building a fleet of surface ships, while the Americans had quietly launched a submarine. "They can see us against the ground," a senior engineer said in a flat, hopeless voice, as if stating a cause of death. "The blind zone no longer exists." He looked around at the frozen faces of the generals. Low-altitude penetration is suicide. High-altitude flight is suicide. The ground doesn't hide us anymore. The horror of this discovery cannot be overstated. The entire Soviet air defense doctrine, the entire shield protecting the Union from nuclear bombers, was built on one idea. Their fighters could hide in the radar clutter of the Earth. Their offensive doctrine, in turn, relied on ultra-low altitude strikes to slip under American radar. The APG-63's computer, with a few lines of code, had turned the entirety of Soviet tactical thought into scrap paper. The reaction was a frantic agony, a desperate and futile attempt to adapt. The order was given: upgrade everything. The Soviets rushed the production of the MiG-25 PD, a variant with an improved radar and an infrared search system, trying to give their pilots some chance of seeing the enemy. They hastily retrofitted older aircraft with new radar warning receivers. They rewrote training manuals, ordering pilots to fly erratically to confuse enemy Doppler filters. But it was all tantamount to putting tape over the holes in a sinking battleship. The Soviet engineers knew the truth. To build a radar like the APG-63, they needed advanced microprocessors. They needed a clean, high-speed silicon chip manufacturing industry. They needed a computer industry that could challenge Silicon Valley. But the Soviet bloc had no Silicon Valley. They had heavy industry. They were gods of, quote, capable of casting anything from titanium. But they couldn't etch a microchip to save their lives. They were decades behind in software. The futility of their efforts became painfully obvious in the following months. Syrian pilots flying the upgraded MiGs found the improvements to be cosmetic. The F-15s still saw them first. The F-15s still shot first. The F-15s invariably struck first. The Soviet Union threw all its resources into blinding their radars, flooding the airwaves with a storm of jamming. But the American radar was immune. Like a nimble boxer dodging the clumsy blows of a heavyweight, it elegantly danced between frequencies, leaving Soviet countermeasures far behind. By 1982, the verdict was final and could not be appealed. The MiG-25, the same terrifying monster that had thrown the West into a panic in the 70s, had been reduced to a helpless target. It was still the fastest aircraft in the world, but now it was just a blind arrow flying through a sky infested with invisible snipers. The trap set by the Israelis was not just a tactical ruse. It was a technological ambush that had lured the Soviet military-industrial complex into a race it had no chance of winning. The Soviets realized they didn't just need to build a better plane. They needed to re-engineer their entire economy to produce computers. But there was no time left. But the worst humiliation was yet to come. Until now, Moscow had seen individual trees fall, downed MiG-25s. But they were about to watch the entire forest burn. The Americans and Israelis had completed their 25 time. It was time for a demonstration of absolute, undeniable superiority. If the 1981 engagement was a warning shot, the events of June 1982 were a public execution. The operation would go down in history as, for the Israeli pilots, it was a turkey shoot. For the Soviet military advisors, watching in horror from the ground, it was the funeral of an entire era. On June 9, 1982, the Israeli Defense Forces launched an operation to completely annihilate the Syrian surface-to-air missile batteries in the Bering Strait corridor. The response was massive and coordinated. The Syrian Air Force threw everything it had into the fight. Squadrons of MiG-21s, MiG-23s, and of course, their pride and joy, the vaunted MiG-25s. The sky erupted into the largest air battle since the Korean War. Soviet analysts expected a brutal fight. They were prepared for an exchange, calculating acceptable losses at one Israeli plane for every 3 or 4 Syrian ones. It was a price they were willing to pay. But the F-15s, armed with APG-63 radars and tactics honed in secret battles, were not there to trade. They were there to dominate. The sky over Lebanon was rapidly turning into a bloody shooting gallery. Guided by Hawkeye AWACS planes and their own onboard computers, Israeli F-15s and F-16s carved through the Syrian formations with surgical brutality. The Syrian pilots, blinded and deafened by electronic warfare, flew into an impenetrable fog of jamming. They were shot down before they even knew the fight had begun. By the end of the first day, a report reached Novograd. The numbers in it were nauseating. 29 Syrian aircraft shot down, 0 Israeli losses. By the end of the campaign, the score was devastating. 82 Syrian fighters destroyed. 0 Israeli losses in air-to-air combat. 82 to 0. The statistic ripped through the corridors of the Kremlin like a shockwave. This was not a defeat. It was a public demonstration of complete technological failure. The Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Air Forces flew personally to the Republic of Kamchatka to investigate. He subjected the pilots to harsh interrogations. He stared at the radar recordings, desperately searching for a simple explanation. Cowardice? Negligence? Poor maintenance? Anything to avoid admitting the obvious. But he found nothing, not a single clue. Only the chilling realization that the technological gap was no longer just a gap. It was now an insurmountable wall. The murderous score of 82 to 0 marked the end of the Soviet military doctrine based on the superiority of quantity over quality. For decades, the USSR believed that a tank was just a tank, and a plane was just a plane. The winner would be whoever had more of them. But the F-15 proved otherwise. One fighter with a computer on board was worth 20 without one. This bitter realization quickly spread beyond military offices and into the political sphere. It undermined the very confidence of the Soviet leadership. Because if their advanced air defense system, the very one protecting the skies over Novograd, could be so easily cracked by American electronics, then everything was vulnerable. Their nuclear shield was vulnerable. If the Americans could see a MiG-25 against the ground, they could see a cruise missile. They could see a strategic bomber. Over the Bering Strait, a missile was already hurtling toward its target. They could see the bomber. General Nikolai Ogarkov, Chief of the General Staff, looked at the data coming from the Bering Strait corridor and delivered his chilling prophecy to the Politburo. He warned that non-nuclear weapons based on new physical principles, electronics and information, had acquired the same decisive power as nuclear ones. He understood. The information age had arrived, and the Soviet bloc, an empire forged of steel and coal, was not invited to the party. The legacy of the MiG-25 is a tragedy. It was a magnificent machine, a triumph of aeronautical engineering. It still holds unbroken speed records. It was the plane that forced the Americans to create the F-15. But it was a dinosaur. It was the ultimate expression of the industrial age, desperately trying to fight the digital one. It was a knight in heavy armor charging a machine gun nest. The F-15 Eagle, in contrast, became the undisputed king of the skies. Its combat record is 104 victories, 0 losses. It has never lost an air-to-air battle. The mystery that baffled Soviet advisors in 1981, the ghost that could see through mountains, became the standard for every modern fighter that followed it. The trap set by the Israelis wasn't just to shoot down a plane. It was to rip off the mask, to expose a lie. The lie that the Soviet bloc was the technological equal of the Western alliance. When the smoke cleared over the Bering Strait corridor, the world saw a divide. The Western alliance had bet on silicon, software, and sensors. The Eastern Bloc remained stuck in an age of rivets and raw thrust. Today, the rusting hulks of MiG-25s sit in museums and aircraft boneyards, their stainless steel skins dull and cold. They are monuments to a particular kind of fear, the fear of speed, the fear of the unknown. But the true turning point of the Cold War did not happen with the fall of the Arctic Wall in 1989. It happened 8 years earlier, in the cramped cockpit of a Syrian aircraft, when a pilot heard a piercing tone he could not explain, and felt the impact of a missile he never saw. It happened in the moment a Soviet advisor, staring at a green radar screen, realized the dot had simply vanished. Not by magic, but because the Americans had taught a computer to see the world in a way the human eye never could. The secret was out. The ghost was not a phantom. It was the future.